We have a warrant. Step back now.
There's a mistake. This address is Oak Street. I'm Marcus Thompson.
Save it.
Hands where I can see them.
I'm the Assistant Attorney General. You're at the wrong house.
Entry team, move!
Oh, God.
The red and blue police lights began flashing at exactly 9:42 p.m. on a calm Tuesday night. This happened in what was known as one of the safest neighborhoods in the entire city. Judge Mark Smith had just pulled into his driveway after a long day at the federal courthouse downtown. He had spent hours handling serious criminal cases and was exhausted. All he wanted was a quiet evening at home with his wife. He had no idea that the next 15 minutes would completely change his life and bring a disturbing pattern of behavior into the open, something that had stayed hidden for years. What happened next was recorded by several cameras, seen by multiple neighbors, and later led to consequences no one expected. This was not a case of confusion or a simple mistake. It was about power, assumptions, and what can happen when someone wearing a badge believes they can scare the wrong person. Judge Mark Smith was 52 years old and had served on the federal bench for 8 years. Before becoming a judge, he worked as a prosecutor for 12 years. Helping put some of the most dangerous criminals in the state behind bars. He lived in Willowbrook Heights, a wealthy suburban neighborhood where many residents were doctors, lawyers, and business leaders. His home sat on a corner lot with a circular driveway, a perfectly trimmed lawn, and a 2-car garage. That Tuesday had been especially draining. Judge Smith had overseen a complicated fraud trial that lasted all day. He listened to hours of testimony and made important decisions that would greatly affect everyone involved. By the time he got home, he was mentally and physically worn out. All he wanted was to greet his wife, relax a little, and maybe read before going to sleep. There was nothing unusual about his night, and nothing that suggested trouble was coming. Officer Danny Rodriguez was 28 years old and had been on the police force for only 4 months. He was still in his probation period, still learning his duties, and still trying to prove himself to his supervisors. What most people didn't know was that Rodriguez had already received 2 complaints during his short time on the job. Both complaints involved what witnesses described as aggressive behavior during normal traffic stops. That evening, Rodriguez was assigned to patrol Willowbrook Heights. He drove slowly through the quiet streets, lined with large homes and expensive cars. The neighborhood was known for being peaceful, with very little crime and almost no police calls. Most officers saw this area as an easy assignment. But Rodriguez was different. He believed he had strong instincts about people and situations. In reality, those instincts were unchecked biases he had never been properly trained to recognize or control. When Rodriguez saw Judge Smith's black Mercedes pull into the driveway of the corner house, something triggered in his mind. A well-dressed black man driving a luxury car in this neighborhood matched the stereotypes Rodriguez carried with him. Judge Smith parked where he always did, picked up his briefcase and jacket from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car. The motion-activated lights turned on, lighting up the driveway and casting long shadows on the ground. He wore a dark suit, a white dress shirt, and a burgundy tie he had loosened during the drive. Everything about him showed professionalism and success. Rodriguez made a quick U-turn and stopped his patrol car at the curb directly in front of Judge Smith's house. He turned on his emergency lights, filling the street with flashing red and blue. The lights caught the attention of nearby neighbors, several of whom looked out their windows, confused about what could be happening in their quiet community. Judge Smith noticed the police car but didn't think much of it. Police vehicles often passed through the area or parked briefly. He continued toward his front door with his keys in hand until he heard a car door slam behind him. Officer Rodriguez walked toward him with his hand resting on his utility belt, moving with an aggressive confidence that some rookie officers develop when trying to assert authority. His voice echoed through the still night as he ordered Judge Smith to stop and turn around. Judge Smith paused, clearly confused, but he complied. Having spent years in the justice system, he knew it was usually best to follow instructions and deal with questions later. He turned slowly, kept his hands visible, and calmly asked if there was a problem. Rodriguez did not properly introduce himself or explain why he had stopped. Instead, he demanded to know what Judge Smith was doing in the neighborhood. The question was so unreasonable that Judge Smith nearly laughed. He was standing in his own driveway, at his own home, holding his keys. Calmly, he explained that he lived there and had just returned from work. Rodriguez looked doubtful. He glanced at the large house, then back at Judge Smith, and asked for identification. Judge Smith handed over his driver's license without hesitation. Rodriguez examined the license carefully, comparing the photo to Judge Smith's face and checking the address against the house number. Everything matched. Still, instead of apologizing, Rodriguez became more suspicious. He asked what Judge Smith did for a living, where he had been that evening. and if anyone could confirm his story. The questions grew more personal and unnecessary. Judge Smith stayed composed. He explained that he worked downtown, had just finished a long day, and that his wife was inside if verification was needed. What he didn't say was exactly what his job was. He wanted to see how far the officer would go. Rodriguez then told Judge Smith to step away from the car and place his hands on the hood. That request crossed a serious line. There was no reasonable suspicion, no legal reason to detain him, and no justification for treating a homeowner like a criminal on his own property. Judge Smith had had enough. In a calm but firm voice, the same one he used in court, he asked Rodriguez to explain the legal reason for the stop. He asked what crime he was suspected of committing and why he was being treated like a suspect when he had done nothing wrong. Rodriguez did not like being challenged. In his mind, people were supposed to obey officers without question, whether the orders were legal or not. Rodriguez raised his voice and told Judge Smith that he was conducting an official investigation. He warned that refusing to cooperate could lead to arrest. This was Rodriguez's first serious mistake. Threatening to arrest someone without probable cause is not only against the law, it is the kind of action that ruins careers and leads to costly lawsuits. But Rodriguez was too new to the job and too focused on showing authority to understand how dangerous his actions were becoming. Judge Smith calmly took out his cell phone and said he was going to record the interaction. Rodriguez immediately ordered him to put the phone away, claiming that recording was interfering with a police investigation. Judge Smith responded calmly and told the officer that he had a legal right to record a police encounter, especially on his own property. The situation was escalating fast. What neither man realized was that several neighbors had already begun recording. Mrs. Patterson, who lived directly across the street, had a clear view of the driveway and was filming with her tablet. The Johnsons, who lived next door, were also recording from their upstairs bedroom window. What was happening in Judge Smith's driveway was now being captured from multiple angles. At 9:58 p.m., Rodriguez's supervisor, Sergeant Patricia Williams, received a phone call. A worried neighbor had contacted the police department to report what appeared to be an inappropriate detention taking place in the neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson had been watching the scene and was deeply disturbed by what she saw. She told the dispatcher that an officer was harassing a man in his own driveway without any clear reason. Sergeant Williams had served on the force for 15 years and had dealt with her share of troubled officers. When she heard the address and learned that Rodriguez was involved, her heart dropped. After the earlier complaints, she had already been monitoring the rookie closely. This call confirmed her worst concerns. Sergeant Williams radioed Rodriguez and asked for an update on his location and activity. His response was unclear and evasive. He claimed he was investigating suspicious behavior in the Willowbrook Heights area, but failed to explain what made the behavior suspicious. When Williams pressed for details, Rodriguez became defensive and insisted that everything was under control. Back in the driveway, Judge Smith continued recording while remaining calm. With years of experience in criminal law, he understood that documentation was critical if the situation got worse. He spoke clearly into his phone, stating his name, the date and time, his address, and describing exactly what was happening. Rodriguez grew more irritated as Judge Smith remained composed and legally informed. Most people Rodriguez had encountered became nervous or intimidated when questioned by police. Judge Smith's confidence and steady responses made Rodriguez feel like he was losing control. Trying to regain authority, Rodriguez escalated the situation. He claimed that he smelled marijuana on Judge Smith and said this gave him probable cause to search him. This was another lie and a serious violation of his training and oath. Judge Smith did not use drugs and there was no marijuana smell. Rodriguez was reaching for any excuse to continue the stop. Judge Smith looked directly at him and calmly said that the officer was lying. He said it without anger or emotion, the same way he would rule on an objection in his courtroom. The words hung in the air, and Rodriguez's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. That was when Rodriguez made the biggest mistake of the night. He grabbed Judge Smith's arm and told him he was under arrest for obstruction of justice and possession of controlled substances. Both charges were completely false with no evidence to support them. But Rodriguez had gone too far to back down. Judge Smith did not resist. He kept recording and spoke clearly for the camera. He stated that he was being unlawfully arrested in his own driveway, that he had committed no crime, and that the officer had no probable cause for a search or detention. His voice stayed calm and professional as handcuffs were placed on his wrists. Mrs. Patterson could no longer stay silent. She stepped out of her house and walked toward the scene, her tablet still recording. She asked Rodriguez why he was arresting her neighbor. Rodriguez turned toward her and ordered her to go back inside. Mrs. Patterson refused. She told him she had recorded everything and that she knew Judge Smith personally. Rodriguez asked how she knew the suspect. Mrs. Patterson stared at him in disbelief and said Judge Smith was not a suspect. She explained that he was a federal judge who lived in the house behind him and was one of the most respected people in the neighborhood. She said she had watched him come home from work the same way countless times before. The color drained from Rodriguez's face. A federal judge. He had just arrested a federal judge in the judge's own driveway based on completely made-up charges. Every instinct told him to remove the handcuffs and try to undo what he had done. But it was too late. The arrest had already happened, the cuffs were on, and multiple people were recording. Sergeant Williams arrived at the scene at 10:07 p.m., exactly 25 minutes after the initial stop. One look told her that her worst fears were real. Rodriguez stood next to a handcuffed black man in an expensive suit while neighbors gathered nearby, filming everything. The tension and body language made the situation clear. Williams first pulled Rodriguez aside and asked to speak with him privately. They stepped a short distance away, though not far enough to escape the cameras. She asked Rodriguez to explain what had happened and what charges he planned to file. His explanation was disorganized and full of vague claims about suspicious behavior and drug possession that he could not support. Williams then looked at Judge Smith, still standing calmly in handcuffs. Something about his posture and presence told her this was not an average citizen. After 15 years on the force and thousands of arrests, she could recognize authority when she saw it. She walked over to Judge Smith and properly introduced herself, something Rodriguez had never done. She asked for his name and occupation. When Judge Smith calmly stated that he was a federal judge, Sergeant Williams closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She knew instantly that this night was about to become the worst moment of Rodriguez's career and possibly her own. Judge Smith remained composed and professional, even as he stood there in handcuffs. Judge Smith calmly explained everything that had happened, starting from the moment Rodriguez approached him up to the present. He mentioned that he had recorded the encounter, that several neighbors had witnessed everything, and that he believed the officer had violated multiple department policies and constitutional rights. Sergeant Williams did not hesitate. She ordered Rodriguez to remove the handcuffs immediately. Rodriguez paused, still holding on to his false claims about probable cause and drug possession. Williams raised her voice and made it clear that this was not a suggestion, it was an order. Rodriguez finally removed the handcuffs, and Judge Smith gently rubbed his wrists where the metal had pressed into his skin. The neighbors who had gathered were not satisfied with just seeing the handcuffs come off. They had watched the entire incident unfold and were demanding to know why their neighbor had been treated this way. The Johnsons stepped forward and introduced themselves as character witnesses. They explained that Judge Smith was a model neighbor who had lived in the community for years without ever causing trouble. Sergeant Williams now found herself in an impossible position. She had a rookie officer who had clearly violated department policy and possibly the law, a federal judge who had been unlawfully arrested, multiple witnesses with video evidence, and a crowd of angry neighbors. Every decision she made from that moment on would be closely examined and could impact her own career. Williams asked Judge Smith whether he wanted to file a formal complaint against Officer Rodriguez. Judge Smith replied that he intended to file several complaints through different channels. These included the police department's Internal Affairs Division, the Civilian Oversight Board, and possibly federal authorities if civil rights violations were confirmed. Only then did Rodriguez begin to grasp the seriousness of what he had done. A federal judge was not just another citizen. This was someone with deep knowledge of the law, strong connections throughout the justice system, and the credibility to demand real accountability. Rodriguez's hands began to shake as he realized his law enforcement career was likely over before it had truly started. Judge Smith entered his home at 10:15 p.m., nearly 35 minutes after what should have been a simple return from work. His wife, Sarah, was waiting in the living room. She had witnessed most of the encounter from the front window and had been recording as well. Her phone captured the incident from inside the house, serving as backup to the videos recorded by neighbors. Sarah Smith was a retired prosecutor, and she immediately understood the legal weight of what had just happened. She had watched her husband handle the situation with impressive restraint, but now that they were alone, she could see the anger and frustration in his eyes. This was not just about one officer's bad decision. It was about a larger pattern of behavior that needed to be exposed and stopped. Judge Smith sat at the kitchen table and began writing detailed notes while everything was still fresh in his mind. He recorded exact times, direct quotes from Officer Rodriguez, the names of witnesses, and his own responses during the encounter. From his years as a prosecutor, he knew that cases were won or lost based on details and he was determined not to miss any. At the same time, Sergeant Williams was facing the hardest conversation of her supervisory career. She walked Rodriguez back to his patrol car, away from the cameras and onlookers, trying to understand how a new officer had managed to create such a disastrous situation in less than 4 months on the job. Rodriguez's explanation kept changing. First, he claimed he had received a call about suspicious activity, but when Williams checked with dispatch, no such call existed. Then he said Judge Smith had acted nervously, even though the video clearly showed a calm and cooperative man. Finally, Rodriguez returned to the marijuana claim, insisting he had smelled drugs. Williams recognized this as a desperate lie. What Rodriguez didn't realize was that his body camera had been recording the entire time. From the moment he turned on his emergency lights, the camera captured every illegal question, every inappropriate demand, and every false accusation. That footage would later become the centerpiece of multiple investigations and legal actions. By midnight, news of the incident was already spreading through law enforcement circles. Judge Smith had contacted several colleagues and officials informing them of what had happened. In the close-knit legal community, word traveled fast. By the next morning, everyone from the police chief to the mayor would know that a federal judge had been unlawfully arrested. The police department's internal affairs division received Judge Smith's formal complaint at 8:30 a.m. the following morning. The complaint was 12 pages long and carefully detailed. It included timestamps for every policy and legal violation. Judge Smith also attached still images from his phone video showing his hands in handcuffs and Rodriguez's aggressive stance. Rodriguez reported for duty that Wednesday morning, unaware that his career was already ending. His supervisor immediately pulled him aside and informed him that he was being placed on administrative leave while a full investigation was conducted. He was no longer allowed to carry a weapon, wear his uniform, or perform any police duties until the case was resolved. The investigation that followed was unlike anything the department had handled before. Most complaints came from civilians with limited legal knowledge or resources. This complaint came from someone who knew exactly which laws had been broken and had the influence to make sure the violations were fully examined. Judge Smith's cell phone video was analyzed by digital forensic experts. The neighbors' recordings were collected and verified. Rodriguez's body camera footage was reviewed frame by frame. Personnel files were examined to identify behavior patterns, and training records were reviewed to see whether Rodriguez had received proper instruction on constitutional rights and appropriate police conduct. What investigators uncovered was deeply troubling. Rodriguez had received previous complaints during his short time on the force, but those complaints had been minimized and dismissed by supervisors who assumed the citizens were simply upset about traffic stops or questioning. No one had taken the time to look for patterns or provide additional training to correct the behavior. The department's training records revealed another serious issue. Rodriguez had completed only the minimum number of required academy hours. Most of that training focused on physical tactics, weapons use, and writing reports. Very little time was spent on constitutional law, de-escalation skills, or learning how to recognize and control implicit bias. This lack of training played a major role in what happened. Judge Smith was not willing to let the police department handle the matter quietly. He filed a formal complaint with the state attorney general's office, requesting a full investigation into possible civil rights violations. He also contacted the FBI's Civil Rights Division, turning over all the evidence he had collected and asking for a federal investigation. Media attention began 3 days later when a local news reporter received an anonymous tip about the incident. The reporter contacted Judge Smith's office for comment, and the judge agreed to an on-camera interview. He appeared calm and professional, as he always did, but his words carried the weight of someone who had spent his life pursuing justice. Judge Smith explained that this situation was not just about what happened to him, even though what occurred was clearly wrong. He said the real issue was a system that allowed undertrained and biased officers to intimidate citizens without consequences. He pointed out that if this could happen to a federal judge in his own driveway, it was frightening to imagine what ordinary people faced without his knowledge, resources, or credibility. The interview aired that same evening and quickly went viral. Social media erupted with outrage as viewers watched footage showing a respected judge being handcuffed at his own home for no valid reason. Legal experts appeared on television to explain the many constitutional violations involved. Civil rights organizations released statements demanding accountability and reform. Rodriguez watched the coverage from his apartment, realizing that his name and face were now known across the country as the officer who arrested a federal judge for simply coming home from work. His phone rang. nonstop with calls from reporters, but on his lawyer's advice, he said nothing publicly while the investigations were underway. 4 days after the incident, the police chief held a press conference. He announced that Officer Rodriguez had been fired and that the department was making immediate changes to its training and supervision policies. The chief apologized to Judge Smith and admitted that serious mistakes had been made. Still, many observers felt the response came too late. 2 weeks later, Judge Smith filed a civil lawsuit in federal court. The lawsuit named Rodriguez, Sergeant Williams, the police chief, and the city as defendants. It sought financial damages and broad reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. The complaint listed violations of the 4th and 14th Amendments: false imprisonment, assault, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The city's insurance company quickly entered settlement talks, knowing a jury trial would be disastrous. Judge Smith had flawless credentials, multiple eyewitnesses, clear video evidence, and deep legal expertise. No reasonable jury would side with the defendants, but money was not Judge Smith's main goal. He wanted lasting changes to protect others from experiencing what he had endured. The lawsuit demanded wide-ranging police reforms, including stronger constitutional training, mandatory bias education, better supervision of new officers, and civilian oversight of misconduct investigation. Rodriguez's criminal defense attorney faced an uphill battle. The evidence of false arrest and civil rights violations was overwhelming. Prosecutors were eager to show that police officers would be held accountable for illegal behavior. Rodriguez now faced passable federal charges that could send him to prison for years. The impact spread far beyond Rodriguez himself. Sergeant Williams was demoted and reassigned to desk duty after investigators found she had failed to properly supervise a troubled officer. The police chief announced early retirement amid growing calls for his resignation. The city council approved emergency funding for police reform programs to reduce future legal risks. Other victims soon came forward with their own stories involving Rodriguez. During his short career, he had stopped dozens of people, and investigators uncovered a clear pattern of targeting individuals based on race and economic status instead of actual criminal activity. Several of these individuals hired lawyers and filed lawsuits, creating a wave of legal trouble for the city. The local newspaper published a detailed investigation into the police department's hiring and training practices. The report revealed that Rodriguez was not an isolated case. Several other officers had troubling complaint histories that were ignored or poorly handled. The investigation led state lawmakers to propose new laws requiring stronger police training and accountability measures. Judge Smith returned to his courtroom while investigations continued. Colleagues noticed that the experience had strengthened his commitment to protecting constitutional rights. His rulings became even more careful and precise, ensuring defendants' rights were fully respected. The community also began to reflect on its own assumptions. Neighborhood meetings were held to discuss what had happened. Many residents admitted they had never considered how differently people of color might be treated by police, even in a safe and wealthy area. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who had confronted Rodriguez and recorded the incident, became an unexpected advocate for police accountability. She organized community meetings, contacted city council members, and spoke publicly about the need for reform. Her courage inspired others to become more involved and speak up. At first, the police union defended Rodriguez, claiming he had followed proper procedures and was being unfairly blamed. But as more evidence emerged and public pressure increased, the union quietly stepped back and focused on protecting other officers. Rodriguez's termination hearing became a public event, with dozens of community members attending. The evidence presented was devastating, showing repeated constitutional violations ignored by supervisors. The decision to uphold his firing was unanimous and sharply critical of his actions. The federal investigation eventually expanded beyond Rodriguez to examine the entire police department's culture. FBI agents interviewed officers, reviewed training materials, and analyzed years of complaint data. Their findings led to a consent decree that required major reforms under federal oversight. Officer Rodriguez's story is a powerful reminder that wearing a badge does not grant unlimited authority and that racial assumptions can destroy careers in moments. Judge Smith's calm professionalism turned a personal injustice into widespread reform that will protect countless people in the future. Justice may move slowly, but when it arrives, it can change everything. What are your thoughts on this case? It was intense, but the case on the right side is even more shocking.